rate of job loss is at stake. So a lot of people will be losing employment, and that's very unfortunate. So, if in a nutshell, if I have to talk about the impact of the COVID-19, I'm sorry, there's a spelling mistake. It should be COVID-19 on the economy. Then the problem is that there is low growth rate, low income, low investment, high unemployment, and what do we call it? We call it a depression or a recession. And this is the problem, we have, had I been in a class with you, I would have put on this question on you. What do you think of it, whether it's a depression or a recession? But I'll explain it here. So the thing is that there's a difference between a depression and a recession. So the difference is that a recession is a downward trend in the business cycle, and one that is characterized by a decline in production and employment. And it's a kind of a temporary phenomenon because it's a business cycle, going down and then again going up. So what happens is that this trend lowers household income and spending, which consequently causes many businesses and households to delay making large investments or purchases. So there's, the moment such a recession takes place, there's a lag, there's a fall in investment and fall in expenditure, right? So that's what is recession. But there's a difference between recession and depression. A depression is a much bigger issue. It's a major downsizing. It is far more severe than a downward trend like a recession in the business cycle. And it is one which is characterized by sharply reduced industrial production, widespread unemployment, a serious decline or cessation of growth in construction, and great reductions in international trade and capital movements. And another major difference between a recession and a depression, in addition to the severity and effects of each, is that recessions may be limited geographically. So recession could be only in Bangladesh or only in India, but depression occurs globally. So the COVID-19 impact is not a recession. Remember, it is a depression because it is a global phenomena that is taking place, and it is a long-run phenomenon. Then you have some other definitions which we are worried about. So I will just explain here. One is stagflation. All of you must have heard of inflation. Inflation is the rising of prices in an economy, but stagflation refers to an economy that has both inflation and a slower stagnant economic growth rate. So on the one hand, the price is rising, and on the other hand, the economic growth is falling. And it's a very severe crisis for the population. A very high unemployment rate occurs, and with stagflation, a country's citizens are affected by high rates of inflation and unemployment. So stagflation in this view is caused by a cost push inflation. We'll talk about that more detail later on. Cost push inflation occurs when some force or condition increases the costs of production. This could be caused by government policies such as taxes, or from purely external factors such as shortage of natural resources or an act of war. So an economic shock refers to any change to a fundamental macroeconomic variables or relationships. So this is a kind of a shock, you see. And when we say it's an economic shock, it affects the economy. So how does it affect? It has a substantial effect on the macroeconomic outcomes and measures of economic performance, such as unemployment, consumption, and inflation. And shocks are often unpredictable and are usually the result of events thought to be beyond the scope of normal economic transactions. And economic shocks have widespread and lasting effects on the economy and are the root cause of recessions and economic cycles in real business cycle theory. So this is definitely an economic shock, the COVID-19, and it's more of an external shock. It's an exogenous shock. An external shock is an unexpected change in an economic variable. So it hits us suddenly, which takes place outside the economy. An example might be an increase in the price of oil having an impact on firms' costs of production. And you can have an internal shock also, where the shock is more endogenous in nature, where the shock that comes from unexpected change in an economic variable which takes place inside the economy. For example, a failure of a bank or any other institution. So the COVID-19 shock is more of an external shock, an exogenous shock for the economy. And then there are some other kinds of shocks which you should be knowing. One is a supply shock. A supply shock is an event that makes production across the economy more difficult, more costly, or impossible for at least some industries. Examples are rise in oil prices that is happening in India, or a war, etc. Then there could be demand shocks. Demand shocks happen when there is a sudden and considerable shift in the patterns of private spending, either in the form of consumer spending from consumers or investment spending from businesses. So examples are stock market crashes, fall in home prices, etc. So, there are some other kinds of shocks which you should also know. One is a financial shock that happens when the modern economies are deeply dependent on the flow of liquidity and credit. So, if one market falls, another market falls also, and that's what happened in 2007 when the American housing market fell. The whole economy went through a huge shock during the time. And then there could be policy shocks, which if a government brings in some wrong policy or a policy that profoundly affects the economy, then the economic impact of the policy shock might even be the goal of the government. It could be an expected side effect or an entirely unintended consequences as well. So fiscal policies in effect are deliberate economic demand shock. It could be positive or negative, intended to smooth out aggregate demand over time. And the imposition of tariffs and other barriers to trade can create a positive shock for domestic industries, but a negative shock to domestic consumers. Then you could have technology shocks in the sense that a technology shock results from technological developments that affect productivity. The introduction of computers, internet technology, and the resulting increase in productivity across many different occupations is an example of a positive technology shock. So, these are some of the other shocks that we should be aware of. Now, let us straight away come to the problem that you are facing right now, the COVID-19 problem and its impact on the economy. So we pose this question as students of economics. I also consider myself a student of economics. I have a lot to learn and learn from you. So solution to the economic problem could be that, it's a demand problem. So if the problem is a demand problem, you should increase demand and you should go for a fiscal stimulus. The government should spend more money on the people. Or the government can also go for a monetary stimulus. There are two kinds of policies that the government can take. One is that the government can go for a fiscal stimulus in the sense that the government can invest money among people, or the government can go for a monetary or expansion stimulus where the government prints money or the government sells bonds, the government buys bonds and gives money. So in these ways, the government can increase the money supply and the government can increase the income also, given what policies they'll take. So on the other hand, some economists are saying, look, this is not actually a demand problem. This is more of a supply problem, because along with the loss of income, which leads to the demand shock, one also needs to account for the widespread and long-lasting supply chain disruptions. And remember what happened in almost all the countries where the COVID-19 got affected is that there was a lockdown. In India, for instance, the lockdown is still going on. I don't know about Bangladesh. I think in maybe some parts of Bangladesh, the lockdown is still on. So if you have a lockdown, then the supply chain breaks down. So you don't, even if you have money, you cannot buy what you want to buy. So if that happens, then you have a supply problem, and that is another issue. We'll be addressing that also. So now, given that we are in a situation where we are in an economic problem and we have to solve that problem, we want to look into whether this economic crisis of 2020 can be related to the Great Depression and to Keynes, because you know that previous to this crisis, this economic crisis, we had another crisis in 1930s, which was called the Great Depression, and it has a lot of similarity with this, which I will show with this problem also. There was a huge fall in growth rate, there was high unemployment, there was a failure of institutions. So whether the Great Depression of the 1930s could be related to the depression that we are having here. And remember, in the 1930s, it was Keynes who advocated the theory of aggregate demand and government spending. So we can use the same Keynesian theory in this particular situation also. So what I'll take you through now is that Keynes debate, first the classics and then the Keynes, and then we'll come to whether Keynes debate can be applied here also in the current present situation. So we'll have a relook at Keynes, just touch upon some of these issues like mercantilism, classical economics of Adam Smith, neoclassical economics, the historical institutional economics. Then came the Great Depression, Keynes entered and he had this new Keynesian theory, and then the monetarists. So this is a kind of a chronological events of what took place before Keynes' entry, and I'm going to just touch upon the mercantilism and this institutional economics. But I'll be more concerned, I'll be more talking about the classical economics and the Keynesian economics, because that would teach us something about how we can solve this current problem based on COVID-19. So just touching upon mercantilism, you should know what mercantilism is. It was dominant in Europe from the 16th century to the late 18th century. The colonial British-based policy of increasing the bullion or gold asset of the country by exporting more and importing less, and accumulating monetary reserves to a positive balance of trade, especially of finished goods. So historically, such policies frequently led to war because it was colonial in nature and also motivated colonial expansion. But actual economics, the theory of economics, the scientific base of economics, comes with a person called Adam Smith, who is known as the father of economics. I'm sure students of economics must have heard his name. And his theory of laissez-faire, which led to the beginning of the classical school. And it happened during the Enlightenment era in Europe in the mid-17th century, which brought a new spirit of scientific inquiry. So Adam Smith wrote a book called An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, which we sometimes call as Only the Wealth of Nations, in 1776. And here he advocated the concept of the free market. He used the term laissez-faire, which means that the market will be in a position to bring the producer and the consumer together in the market. So the demand and the supply would be equated in the market. No one needs to worry about it, and there should be no government intervention. And because this laissez-faire, he also calls this the invisible hand, because it's like a ghost, you can't see it, but it will lead to an equilibrium of demand and supply. So this was the idea of the classical school started by Adam Smith, and it went on for a long time. And the classical school dominated the thinking process of economists in at least the first half of the 19th century. And the most important figure here is probably David Ricardo, again, a person whom you must have heard, a very famous economist. Karl Marx also built his economic analysis upon Ricardo's theories. And economists like Marshall, Smith, Pigou believed in the existence of full employment in the laissez-faire economy. So they believed that there was a self-adjustment system in the economy. And also the classical school believed in existence of full employment in the economy and considered it as a normal situation, existence of automatic adjustment mechanism in the economy, and wages and prices and rate of interest were assumed to be flexible. So if there is no demand, the prices would fall, the rate of interest would fall, the wages would fall, and the economy would adjust. That was the idea. And the famous law that you had here in this classical theory is Say's law, which says that supply will create its own demand. You need not worry about demand. The economy will adjust in its own way if your demand falls. And this Say's law comes from a book called Treatise on Political Economy, written by the French economist Jean-Baptiste Say's in 1803. And it is a classical economic theory that says that the income generated by past production and sale of goods is a source of spending that creates demand to purchase current production. So basically, this is the idea of a classical economy. It's self-adjusting. If the demand falls, the wage rate cut happens. There's a reduction in cost. Prices fall. The moment prices fall, demand rises. The more demand rises, production rises, more employment, and again you reach a full employment. So it's a self-adjusting circular process. This is the typical classical economy. And of course, the classical economy is based on two very important assumptions, which later on was found to be wrong. One is that higher wages will lead to more supply of labor, but less demand of it. So wage prices will fall due to established equilibrium, because the wages are flexible. It depends on the demand for labor. And lower wages will lead to less supply of labor, but more demand of it. So wage price will rise to establish equilibrium. So whether wages fall or rise, it will always come to an equilibrium because of the flexibility of wage and prices. And this is what I'm talking about, that if you have a demand for labor, you have a supply for labor, then if the supply rises, the wage rate will fall. So if the supply rises, the wage rate will fall, and again it will come to the equilibrium. So this was the concept of full employment that the classical economists considered. And you had the goods market equilibrium, where the savings would always equal investment. So there would be no issues on the savings investment part. And also you had the money market, the money supply and money demand, which was based on the quantity theory of money. So the higher price level in the market would indicate a higher money supply. So the price would reflect the money supply in this kind of an economy. So this is the typical classical, based model that lasted for a long time. And this is the kind of model that you are talking about in the money market, the equilibrium of liquidity and supply of money. Now comes so this classical theory went on for a long time until the Great Depression comes up in 1929. So there's a dramatic crash of the stock market, like what's happening now in Dhaka stock market, and it's called the Black Thursday, October 24th, 1929, when 16 million shares of stocks were quickly sold by the panicking investors who had lost faith in the American economy. So if you're panicked, if you think that the share market will fall, many people will go and sell stocks, so the stock market will crash. So the Great Depression was the worst economic downturn in the history of the industrialized world, lasting from 1929 to 1939, and then we had the Second World War. So what caused the Great Depression? It was a stock market crash, decline in money supply, less deflation, and wrong policy decisions. I'll be talking about that within a bit, the Hoover tax and the Smoot-Hawley tariff. So basically, if the stock market crashes, then the big people become poorer, so they are scared. They will sell their stocks, and there's lesser consumer spending and more on savings because the people are worried about the future. Like what's happening now, people are storing food, people are saving money. They don't want to spend because they don't know what's going to happen in the future. They might lose their job and all that. So if deflation would have been enough, then the Great Depression could have been contained, but that was not the case. There was a severe deflation and wrong policy decisions. So this is what was happening in the 1930s. You can relate this to what's happening now in our economy. Billions of people lost their jobs. Billions of dollars lost as the stocks crashed, and there was joblessness everywhere. So it was a really very unfortunate sight of the 1930s. So to give you the actual scenario in a small bit, what happened was the stock market crashed. The total value of the stock on the New York Stock Exchange declined to 20% of the amount they have been worth in September 1929. And this was because of the economic boom in the 1920s. There was overproduction, and hence the supply was greater than the demand. And the effects of stock market crash was that people became poorer, and hence consumption decreased. People became more pessimistic, and hence they increased saving activities and reduced consumption. And hence the aggregate demand fell as consumption and investment both decreased. So there was decline in money supply and less deflation. Causes of decline in money supply was margin trading. People did not pay loans and let banks keep their devalued stock. So you had a lot of default, which we're having now. Also, a lot of people are unable to pay back their loans. So there was panic caused by people to withdraw their money from the banks as they were suspicious of sustainability of banks. So once the banks start failing, then you are scared about your money in the bank. So you want to jump and get your money back from the bank. And automatically, if everyone goes to the bank to collect his or her money, then the banks will crash. There was less deflation. Recessionary gap was created because real GDP was lower than the potential real GDP, and the proper deflation would have actually filled this gap. So this is the kind of situation. The money supply, if you look from 1929 to 1933, the money supply went down drastically from $26.4 billion to 19.4, and there were wrong policy decisions, and the governments have to be careful about it. So the government was scared about what would happen. The fiscal deficit was going up. So the President Hoover increased taxes to meet budget deficits. As according to classical theory, it was bad for the economy and should never exist. And this tax actually increased unemployment rate much more because there were layoffs and companies closed. And the Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1930 was imposed, which the Congress imposed very high taxes on imported goods to encourage consumption of American goods and hence increase employment. But unfortunately, what happened was it was just the opposite. Other countries also imposed high taxes on American products, and American producers incurred higher costs of production due to high taxes on imported material used in production as parts. So basically, this was the end of the classical theory, the classical economics. And it was a failure of classical economics. Classical economists believe that recession should have gone automatically with the help of market forces, that is demand and supply. No serious policies were undertaken by government because according to classical economics, government didn't see any need of intervention. Federal Reserve System was more concerned about inflation that would have ideally taken place as per quantity theory of money. Prices did fall, but not as much as required. Large corporations who had limited competition could establish a control over the prices. However, the production also fell extensively. So wages also fell, but not sufficiently enough to generate full employment. This was due to the power of big labor unions and who wouldn't let the wage rates fall beyond an extent. So, we call it the sticky wages and the sticky prices. So once prices go up, it generally doesn't come down. And once wages go up, wages generally do not come down. So the classical theory completely failed here to see to it that labor unions actually could keep the wages as they are, even in a recession. So that was a big failure of the classical theory. And you can have a look at what's happening. Although the nominal interest rate is going down, the real interest rate is actually not changing, or it's going up. And the difference between the real interest rate and the nominal interest rate is that real interest rate is adjusted to remove the effects of inflation and gives the real rate of bond or loan. So it is reflective that the real interest rate didn't work. Wages did not go down. In fact, wages were going up after a point of time because of the labor unions, and the cost price index was also not going down. It was just toiling around 80 to 78 to 80. So enter John Maynard Keynes with his book, which is called The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money. And John Maynard Keynes had a very strong argument for the government to spend money. And he argued that the government spending was a critical factor driving aggregate demand. That meant an increase in spending would increase demand. Second, Keynes argued that government spending was necessary to maintain full employment. And Keynes advocated deficit spending during the contractionary phase of the business cycle. Now, don't try to copy these things. I'll be sharing this PPT with you. So just listen to what I have to say, right? And therefore, Keynes advocated the government spending, and he said that it's only the government spending that could lead people for more employment. And the government need not worry about the deficit spending because this is the contractionary phase of the business cycle. And once the business cycle goes up, the deficit can be adjusted. So this was his idea. Now, since you are first year grad students, I don't know whether you have come through the equations of aggregate demand and the multiplier. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about how we look at this aggregate demand and aggregate supply theory. So when we say that aggregate demand equals aggregate supply, it means that income is equal to output. So this is the real GDP. And the real GDP, in the real GDP, income equals your consumption of the economy, expenditure, and the net exports. So that is the money that comes in the economy. Okay, so I've assumed C to be the consumption, and I the investment, G government expenditure, and NX is the net exports. And C, the consumption part, is a part of the autonomous consumption. When we are not earning anything, we are consuming. That's the autonomous part. And also our consumption is based on the taxes. Remember, we earn income, but we have to also pay our taxes from that. So Y minus T is the net income. And we don't actually consume whatever we earn. So if you are getting 100 takas, we keep 30 takas for savings for our future and spend 70 takas. So the marginal propensity to consume is always less than 1, and therefore this is the consumption equation. C equals C0 plus C into Y, and so the marginal propensity to consume is positive number lying between 0 and 1, which captures the proportion of disposable income that goes for consumption spending, right? And in equilibrium, what happens is that the marginal propensity to consume and the marginal propensity to save equals 1. So then if you plug in all this into the equation, into your total income equation, then you get the value of the multiplier, which is 1 by 1 minus MPC, right? So this multiplier tells you that if you increase government expenditure by 1 unit, then the multiplier will mean that it will flow into the economy, and it might be multiplying in terms of the flow, the expenditure. So the government spending multiplier actually has a bigger effect in the economy, and similarly the tax multiplier also have a bigger effect in the economy. So the following formula gives the impact of the real GDP of a change in government expenditure. It's 1 by 1 minus MPC into the change in government expenditure. So if you're having a fiscal policy, it is more effective in countries with greater marginal propensity to consume, like India and Bangladesh, where people consume more because they are poor, many of them, and because these countries tend to have a greater government expenditure. Okay, so in a similar way, we can derive the tax multiplier TM, and the tax multiplier also has the same kind of impact, in the sense that if tax goes down, your consumption will rise, your income will rise. But always remember this, and this is for the students, that the magnitude, the size of government expenditure is always greater than the magnitude of the tax. So what does that mean? It means that an increase in G, the government expenditure, is more effective than the same size of decrease in T. So the government expenditure has the opposite sign compared to that. So if you raise tax, it means you're taking away money. If you're raising government expenditure, it means you're giving money to the people. And remember that the same directional result can be achieved if G is increased or if T are decreased, and vice versa. So the final implication is that if both the government expenditure and taxes increase by the same amount, thus the government is running a balanced budget, then the net effect on the real GDP is not zero, but of the different magnitude of the government and taxes. So please keep that in mind, that the government expenditure has a much more bigger impact than tax reduction. So what Keynes, said was that given this scenario, you should address this Great Depression by increasing your investments, increasing government expenditure, because this Great Depression is happening because of lack of consumption, and your aggregate demand has gone down, has decreased. So the investment also didn't increase due to fear of losses, and the classical self-adjusting mechanism failed. Keynes said that government intervention is necessary. He also stated that underemployment equilibrium also could occur. So this is the scenario, in the short period, there's a famous saying by Keynes that in the long run we are all dead, so don't worry about the long run, think of the short run. In the short period, the level of national income is determined by aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So even if you don't achieve full employment, doesn't matter, even in underemployment, you can have the aggregate demand, aggregate supply equilibrium. So that is what I said. You can have AD equal to S even in underemployment, and equilibrium could be established when the demand is not at its peak, and still more employment could be generated. So this is a kind of a scenario. So you have a full employment here, right? This is a full employment, but you are having an equilibrium below that. So you will have some unemployment. So this is the measure of unemployment. LT minus LF is your measure of unemployment. So this is the difference between the Keynes and classical economy. Went for full employment. Keynes said full employment is very unrealistic. Classical economics went for a free hand economy, laissez-faire economy. Keynes said the government intervention is required. Classical economy talked about automatic self-adjustment. Keynes said that it's impossible to have automatic adjustments. Classical theory proposed full employment. Keynes said it's always going to be an underemployment. Some people will be always unemployed. And classical theory suggested that money is the only medium of exchange, whereas Keynes said that money is a medium of exchange and acts as a store of value. Now, let us quickly, having talked about Keynes and the classical theory and how Keynes helped the governments to come out of the Great Depression, let us have a look at the present pandemic and see whether we have something to talk about the Keynesian economy. So the IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva, she addressed the global economy on March 23rd, 2020, and she said that the IMF expects the global economic growth in 2020 to be negative, recession as least as bad during the global financial crisis or worse. So she is relating this to the global financial crisis that happened in the 1930s, and the global pandemic related to the COVID-19 virus and the ensuing constriction of economic activity have presently in 2020 brought the global economy to a standstill with the prospect of a prolonged and severe recession to follow. This is what she says. The exact magnitude of this shock to the world economy is of course uncertain, as is the length of the current recession. However, many fear that the drop in the global GDP level will be significant. So the question is whether this is a demand shock or a supply shock. So much of the interventions undertaken by foreign governments, including the governments of India and Bangladesh, and the central banks, include income replacement, monetary easing. That means, they are giving money to the people, poor people. They are giving loans to the business class, and they follow a standard playbook developed over the years. All this comes from the Keynesian theory. But however, in the rush to roll out these measures, some basic facts about the current economic challenges seems to have escaped attention. So one is that this is the first economic shock after the establishment of the modern monetary system that reduces both demand and supply simultaneously. Because along with the loss of income which leads to the demand shock, one needs to account for the widespread and long-lasting supply chain disruptions. So once you have a lockdown and all that, the supply chains, as I was telling you earlier, would be destroyed. So this will be compounded with the reverse migration of labor to the villages, which will affect both demand as incomes are lost and supply as labor shortages manifest. So while demand destruction is immediately visible and supply disruptions will become apparent only with time, it is extremely tempting to treat this as a demand shock and take appropriate measures. Direct transfer for individuals, bailouts for industry, and monetary and liquidity easing. And while they seem to provide some palliative relief, after all, throwing money at an economic problem always seems to help in the short run. So these are short-run kind of phenomena that you give money to the people, you defer the bank payments and all that. But in the long run, this could be a problem because you have to run the economy. So these very measures will be economically poisonous if supply reduces even more, causing widespread inflation at a time when economic activity is falling. So you have to be careful that, in the course of action, if you go on spending, then after a point of time, if the economy doesn't recover, then you will end up in a very bad scenario. So that's a specter that haunts every economy that has implemented a demand shock oriented fiscal and monetary stimulus. So therefore, I have explained this in my flyer that I had sent earlier. I hope all of you had gone through it, that we look at it more as a supply constraint Keynesian equilibrium because there was this lockdown. So following the lockdown imposed in India and in Bangladesh and elsewhere in response to the pandemic, there was a major supply bottleneck that emerged. And this phenomena added to the existing demand constraint problem faced by the economies, a problem of supply failures. So when the two of these are put together, the resulting scenario appears to resemble what we call a supply constraint Keynesian equilibrium. So I'm proposing a model here. It's called the supply constraint Keynesian equilibrium. It's just simple Keynesian theory that we did earlier. So let's just look at it from this angle. So this is a pre-COVID equilibrium, right? So pre-COVID equilibrium is a normal simple Keynesian model. I'm just doing a simple Keynesian partial model equilibrium here. I'm not doing the complete Keynesian because I know you're undergrad students and many of you may not have gone through this earlier. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to look at aggregate demand as a function of income and the rate of interest. And this is my autonomous consumption and investment. Then a part of the consumption depends on income. Part of investment depends on the rate of interest, which is constant. Government expenditure is there, and the net exports is there. So it's a simple Keynesian model, and in the Keynesian construct, both consumption and investment have an autonomous part, which we club together as A bar 1. 1 because this is a pre-COVID scenario. And the government expenditure and net exports as presented by G and NX, like the variable I, the price level is held fixed in the simple Keynesian model. So I'll show you this figure. This is figure 1. And let me just look at what happens after the pandemic, after the COVID-19 has an impact on the economy. So post-COVID-19, major problem that the world faces is that there is no vaccine for this huge pandemic. So what is the other option? The other option is to go for lockdown and social distancing. Now, the moment you go for lockdown and social distancing, two constraints on economic activity, one affecting demand and the other affecting supply. So we call these transaction costs induced constraints. Because on the demand side, the transaction cost imposes an extra psychological restriction on the Keynesian consumption function itself. The possibility of contracting the disease. So, I'm scared that I might have the disease. So I will not go to the market. I will not mix with others. And it will have a fear in me. So this disease has created an enormous fear amongst all of us. consisting of a perceived high cost of healthcare associated with participation in the transaction process. So my daily transaction will go down, and I will try to avoid the market, and this will cause a fall in both the autonomous expenditure and induce parts of consumption demand. So demand will definitely fall because of my dissociation with the market, right? Also, now this is the other part. The lockdown inflicted sudden shrinking of income flows and negative expectation that the future will continue to be gloomy will weaken demand as well. And hence, uncertainty about the future, which Keynes referred to as state of confidence, impacts both autonomous and induced investment demand. So both autonomous and induced investment demand will go down in the economy because of the COVID-19. Now, what is a supply constraint? The lockdown will keep workers away from the workplace. So, a lot of people will not go to work because of social distancing, because of transport problem and all that, even though there are enough willing workers and employers in the economy. So what will happen if the people don't go to work? They will reduce the flow of production. This can be looked upon as an unboundedly high transaction cost incurred by firms to bring in workers to the production site. So if some firm today wants to bring the workers, they will have to arrange for transport, arrange for social distancing, arrange for sanitizers and all that. So that will mean an increase in the expenditure, increase in the cost of the firms. So that is the supply constraint that I'm talking about. Okay, and this supply constraint is already there everywhere. I did about the garment industry problem in Bangladesh, how it's very difficult to maintain social distancing and also go for the garment industry production. So put differently, the lockdown creates a supply-related artificial capacity constraint for production, which is significantly below the pre-lockdown supply constraint, which I call as Ymax. I'll be describing this later in a diagram. So on account of the transaction cost during the lockdown, the total or partial, the aggregate demand function changes to, now this is the second equation that I have, which is that the aggregate demand will be equal to the autonomous consumption. But now here you have the transaction cost that will go up. So the demand of the population will go down because of the transaction cost. This is having a negative impact, mind you, not a positive impact. The consumption will go down because of the transaction cost. Investments will go down because of the transaction cost. And your net exports will also go down because of the transaction cost. So all this means that 82 will be less than 81, and the 82 transaction cost constraint, 82 is a transaction cost constraint aggregate demand. So let me now share the figure of what is going to happen. So this is my pre-COVID scenario. And in the pre-COVID scenario, what happens is that I have three equilibriums and demand will fall. You see, you have an equilibrium 1, which is called the E11. So there are three equilibria, E11, E21, and E31. And these are all associated with equilibrium incomes or outputs Y11. The outputs here Y11, Y21, and Y31. And here Y21 denotes the output in the period immediately preceding the, so this is the equilibrium. This is immediately preceding the period of which the output is Y11 here. And similarly, Y13 precedes Y12. So we have deliberately chosen Y12 minus Y13, which is greater than Y11 minus Y12 to capture. So the difference captures the measure of growth rate changes, and this artifact plays a part in the analytical role. So what happens is there is inadequate capacity utilization in all cases with equilibrium output falling short of Ymax. So this is my Ymax. This is the 45-degree line where demand equals supply. This is my Ymax, and actually I end up at Y13 because of the fall in growth. And then I come to the post-COVID-19 case. So in the post-COVID-19 case, you have the scenario where of course you go down much more, and there are new capacity constraints. So actually, because of the capacity constraint, you are not in a position to produce at Ymax. You are producing much lower at Y bar, and therefore in the post-COVID scenario, your output, which was at Y13, is now here at Y23. So the the output falls because of this capacity constraint, because you're unable to bring your laborers, you're unable to have the cost of sanitizers and all that. The total capacity constraint falls, and therefore this is the supply, we call it the supply constrained output, which is much more than the demand constrained output. So if you take the supply constraint and demand constraint together, then your output would be much lower, your demand would be much lower. So this is the argument that is posed, that because of the COVID-19, you should not look at demand only, you should be looking at the supply constraint. And if you look at both, then you will end up at D1 and Y23, which is much lower than just looking at the demand constraint, which is your Y23 and E21. Right. So that is the argument that I pose here, that look at the supply constraint also, not only the demand constraint. And I will end because I think I'm almost 1 hour. So I'll end with some thoughts on of people who are very famous or Nobel laureates. So let me just talk about what they think. So Joseph Stiglitz, who is a Nobel laureate and who was in the World Bank, he says that it is clearly a case where targeted fiscal policy is what is needed. It's been true for a long while that monetary policy only have limited efficacy. But this is a different kind of crisis than normal crisis. It's just not a problem of agreement. Because of the disease, people are shutting down their businesses. In the United States, restaurants in New York City have been closed. More demand is not going to save their particular problem. So you need a different kind of a scenario here. That's what Joseph Stiglitz is saying. And Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo, who won the Nobel Prize this year, they say that the government should spend more. Their advice to the government is that be much bolder with the social transfer schemes. So they're asking the government to spend more and more and more on the people. Without that, the demand crisis will snowball into an economic avalanche, and people will have no choice but to defy orders. And I will quote Professor Muhammad Yunus, who had said that coronavirus has given us an opportunity. Let us go to a different place. He talks about a place where we have, which is a path of, where there is no global warming, there is no concentration of wealth, there is no inequality, and we are in a scenario where everyone is happy and greed is gone. So I will end with a word of Tagore here, going with Muhammad Yunus. Tagore says that the highest education is that which does not merely give us information but also teaches us to think. And
Hello, you are not audible anymore, Otiangshu. I think there is some problem of.
Maybe his net is
Ma'am,
disconnected.
Yes,
yes, ma'am. I
probably.
think
Yes, I
his
think so.
internet has been
Yes,
disconnected.
well, so just wait there. I mean, to কথা বলে নিচ্ছি, so to wait, okay? Just bear for a moment. So please wait. We'll be logging in again, probably. আচ্ছা, আমাকে শোনা যাচ্ছে? তোমরা আমার কথা শুনতে পাচ্ছ?
জি ম্যাম পাচ্ছি।
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, ma'am.
Just wait করুন, উনি আবার লগ ইন করছেন, ঠিক আছে? একটু wait.
Yes, ma'am.
So it's a bit of time he's taking probably he has got internet connection. So আমি একটু তোমাকে কোয়েশ্চেন জিজ্ঞেস করি, কে কতটা বুঝলে বা খুব তোমাদের মাথার উপর দিয়ে চলে গেল কিনা একটু বলতে পারো। সিনিয়ররা বলো।
Ma'am, the way he actually explains is so smoothly and so simply.
Right.
I mean, it sounds really easy, you know, like এত কমপ্লেক্স জিনিসগুলো উনি খুব সুন্দর মতো এত মানে ইজিলি বুঝাচ্ছে, মানে শুনতেছি যখন মনে হচ্ছে আমি সবই বুঝছি।
আচ্ছা,
বাট উনি যখন পড়ে যায় তখন ওর জিনিসটা আবার দেখি হচ্ছে ও আচ্ছা ওয়েট উনি এটা এভাবে বলছে, বাট দিস ইজ মাচ কমপ্লিকেটেড। সো বেসিক্যালি উনার এটা
তোমরা কিছুটা বুঝবে, তোমরা যেহেতু ইন্টারমিডিয়েট ম্যাক্রো পড়ছো কিছু ব্যাকগ্রাউন্ড তো আছে, কিন্তু তোমাদেরকে জিজ্ঞেস করলাম। হ্যাঁ ওটাই তো, ওটার জন্য মানে
ফাইন্যান্সিয়াল ক্রাইসিস গুলো যেগুলো ম্যাম পড়েছে ওগুলোর সাথে অনেকটা রিলেট করতে পারছে।
ওকে, আই থিংক হি হ্যাজ জয়েন্ড আস again. Ojivanshu, yes, you can carry on.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. The internet went off. You know, it's a bit of a problem. So let me just, just very quickly get into this. So where was I? I don't know, because I went on with the presentation, you know, and then I suddenly found that something was wrong. So can you tell me where
at the very end? At the very end. At the very end.
You were saying about Rabindranath Tagore's.
Rabindranath Tagore quote.
Okay, so is it this one? Sorry.
At the very end, Tagore's quote যখন ছিল ওটা একদম last, that was the last slide.
Okay, so I was almost done.
Yes,
okay,
yes.
so okay, so so you know, all of you are aware of Rabindranath Tagore, and he said that the highest education is that which does not merely give us information but makes our life in harmony with all existence. So that is what also Muhammad Yunus said, that we should be rethinking our lives, whether we want to have more greed, more more cars, more lavish lifestyle, or we want to live a life of harmony with nature. And Tagore also dreamed of this kind of an economy where we are above greed, and we are living with nature. And this is where we have Shantiniketan, where we live with nature, we study under the trees, we teach under the trees, and all of you are invited to Shantiniketan. It's a unique place. And with that, I would like to thank you all. I'm very happy to be associated with Delta University, and thank you for listening to me. Thank you. And you can also contact me in my, if you want to send any emails, it's achiransu@gmail.com, where you can send emails. So on I end there. I would like to thank all the students and faculty members for listening to me.
Sir, can I ask a question?
Okay, you have an immediate question. Very good. Yeah. So
Sir,
is
I wanted to ask you, as you said that, yes sir, student.
Okay. What's your name?
Sir, Aditi.
Aditi, yes, Aditi, yes, I can see you, yes.
Sir, as you said before, that Keynesian law during the Great Depression, they because of some policies they had Great Depression, right? Like increasing the import tax. Sorry, increasing the export taxes and all that. And if you see now also in this pandemic, like in Bangladesh and in some countries, they too increase the import taxes. So
yeah,
is
you
it
see,
feasible?
right. I see. The thing is that it's like between the devil and the deep sea, because on the one hand, the government has to spend a lot of money because a lot of people are losing their jobs. The economy is going down. So on the one hand, the government has to spend money, and the government has a lot of money, has a lot of reserves. But how long can it spend? Because the more you spend, and if you cannot earn anything, you have a budget deficit. Now, for an economy like Bangladesh, I don't think putting up a tax on imports would be a good idea, because Bangladesh is very much dependent on imports, right? It doesn't have a very resilient, own kind of an economy. And also it depends on its exports. So if Bangladesh imposes an import tax for other goods coming into its country, then other countries can also impose taxes on the exports that Bangladesh is doing. Right. So that, and that is what happened in America in the 1930s. American government decided to raise the taxes because they thought that if we raise our taxes.
But sir, when the Keynesian law was made, Sir, I wanted to ask you that when this Keynesian law was made, that time this type of pandemic was not there, right? So, did he made this aggregate demand and supply? This pandemic is also, is it accountable? Like can we apply his law in this pandemic too?
Yes, see, that is what that is what you are going to debate. What you are going to debate as students, whether the Keynesian law can be applied here, the Keynesian theory can be applied here. I just try to make an analysis because what we look at when we fall in a crisis, we try to look at the past, whether any such crisis took place, and then we try to learn from it a little bit that whether we can address in the same way this crisis, or we have to look into something else. And that is what you students also should think about, and you can write a paper on this or write an essay on this. What do you think? But what you're saying is right, because one major difference with the pandemic now and the Keynesian system, that because of the Great Depression, is that the Great Depression happened because of the institutions. The stock market failed, banks failed, but this pandemic is not a part of the economic institution failure. It's an attack on humanity. And the attack on humanity, attack on our health system is affecting the economy. So this is not at all like the depression. But as an economist, when you look at it, you have to look at how the economy is running because of the pandemic. I'm not a doctor, I cannot give you a vaccine. But I'm an economist, I can tell you as a government what you should do. So these are kinds of the different kinds of analysis that are going on. And I think somewhere Keynes also comes in, because Keynes talks about the rising of aggregate demand, government expenditure, and most of the countries, including India and Bangladesh, are doing that. So I hope that the vaccine comes in very quickly, maybe within the next few months, and you are out of this pandemic. So if that happens, then it's fine. But if the pandemic goes on for another 1 or 2 years in this way, then it will be very difficult for any economy to survive.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yes, sir. I have a question. Sir,
Hello.
sir, it's Rafi Mohammed. Sir, there are countries that goes through recession once every year, right?
Yes, those are business cycle recessions you're talking about. You're talking about the business cycle.
Yeah. Sir. Yeah, sir. And my question is it gonna be any more? Is it gonna be like more challenging for economies like more stable economies like ours or India or China to overcome this shortage of supply situation, comparing to those countries that goes through business cycle recession?
Well, so the difference between a business cycle recession and what's happening now is that a business cycle recession goes down and then it comes up after a point of time, right? So the expectation is, so what you're trying to say is how we will recover. You are talking about the recovery. Now, I have 3 answers for that. And there's a lot of debate and discussion going on that. One section of economists, they say that the recovery will be V-shaped. Why V-shaped? Because a lot of people, they want to go to cinema halls, they want to go to restaurants, they want to spend more, they have the money, but they cannot spend more because of the lockdown, because of all these constraints, right? So the moment the lockdown is open and you get the vaccine and all that, then there will be a huge flow of money in the market. People will be spending a lot of money for entertainment. They will go to hotels and all that. So the recovery will be V-shaped. That is one argument. The other argument is that, because of the supply constraint and the huge loss that many of the economies have faced, it will not be a V-shape because people don't have income and they are also scary. So it will be a U-shaped recovery. So the moment the vaccine comes up, people will be spending, but a lot of people have lost jobs. So they first need to get the jobs. They first need to actually get themselves stable, and then only they can spend. So, the recovery will come maybe in 2022, 2023, right? So it will be a U-shaped curve. That's one of the arguments. And the third argument is that it will be an L-shaped curve. So you have an L. So what happens is that because of this shock in the economy, most of the country's economy has gone down like this. It's a straight, like if you look at Bangladesh, from 8% to 2% in 2-3 months. And then, it will be unable to recover because it will have a serious crisis. The problem of this economy will be permanent in nature, and therefore after the pandemic goes away, it will be L-shaped. So if you have an L-shaped curve, then what happens is that the economy goes into recession. And then it is very difficult. You have to take loans from IMF or the World Bank. You have to go for some other sources of income. So these are the 3 kinds of analysis that economists have made post the COVID-19 impact.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Do you have time to take any more questions from students? I'm not sure whether they have any more question or not.
Yeah, if they have questions, I can take. I'm always ready to take questions from students.
Okay, students, do you have any more questions?
I would like to ask one question, sir.
Priya, we need to see you as well. Please turn your video. Yes.
Yes, Imran.
Yes, sir. During the presentation, like the first part, there was a chart where you showed like the economic growth projections of the countries. So for the ongoing fiscal years, we saw the economic growth for like most of the countries negative, but only China somehow showed a little positive growth. So why is this so? Whereas like China is the source of the main problem, right, sir? And the other big players like Japan, Netherlands, Spain, all of them showed negative economic growth. Thank you.
Yeah, right. So, that's a good question. The thing is that you see of course, the virus came from China, but the impact on the Chinese economy was, yes, it's now China's growth rate is around 0.5, 0.6 if you look at that. But the impact of the virus was more on other countries than on China. So, it was like in the USA or in Spain or in Holland, I mean, not Holland, in Spain or Italy, England, even now in India, the impact was very severe. But China could very quickly come out of that because, they had it in one place and they actually locked down that place, arranged for the complete shutdown of the area from where the virus actually started. So they, when America and other European countries were fighting with the COVID-19, China was in the process of recovery. So that is why, if you look at a certain higher percentage for China, and China is in fact now doing well. In fact, it has now started business. It is starting production, and perhaps China is in a better position now as compared to America or European countries.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Sir, I'd like to ask you a question. Sir, what do you think? What do you think about the reaction of the German economy, where Germany the government is subsidizing a lot of businesses, and for the small business they are actually lending money without loan, and for the big businesses they are lending out with like a like a low interest rate. But then, like in terms of the long run, like if the pandemic lasts for a long time, but won't, as you said in your the slides, that it will affect the economy.
Okay, so one of the countries that have done really well to fight the virus is Germany. If you look at the German population that have suffered from the COVID-19, it's very low, lowest in Europe perhaps. And Germany has a very good health system. Therefore, the economy of Germany has not been affected that much by the COVID-19 as in America or in countries like Italy or Spain.
Okay.
Right.
So, sir, another thing that I want to talk to you about is like, like I have this idea of like what a government should do, but then like you would have much better idea like if this is actually eligible or not. Like I'm thinking like the government should actually subsidize in some certain areas, like since in terms of the long run, if this does not end, government can actually subsidize in businesses for like running the safety measures. Like for example, in the garments industry is very important for us. So to keep the garments industry running, like for the safety protocols and some of maintaining the workers, like if the government can subsidize in some sections, like the sanitation and the protection for the workers, and the business can actually run by itself.
See, that is one point that I wanted to make, that, because of the social distancing and the sanitization and all that, there would be a cost push. So the production cost would go up for these companies, because the companies have been doing operations in a very low cost scenario.
Exactly.
And we are all aware of the garment industry, the laborers, their condition in the garment industry in Bangladesh. That is a big debate, that is going on, especially with women, because women laborers need a lot more comfort zone. They have children and all that. So perhaps this is a new moment of thought for the Bangladesh government, whether they can help the producers in bringing out a good system of work, a good scenario of work, so that the laborers, the people who are working, the women who are working, they can actually have a good life. So this is a challenge for the Bangladesh government, but if this can be done, then it will be really good for the people who are working in the garment industry.
Yeah, and another thing is, like, how about if the governments actually, like the government actually subsidize in, like, the sanitation department, for example, the private industries that are actually making hand sanitizer, the effective hand sanitizer, if government would subsidize them to, like, sell those things at a very lower price.
Yes, I think that is there. I think all these products that are being made, I think they have zero taxes. I think that is a kind of policy that almost all the governments have taken everywhere. That if you are producing sanitizers, if you are producing masks and all that, then you get a huge tax. In fact, you have zero tax. So those things I think are happening in Bangladesh also. It's happening in India. I know in India, those who are making these things, they are not taxed, or they are not penalized or anything like that.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Thank you, students. Do you have any more questions? It's really good to see that you were really participating in this session. But the thing is that we do have a quiz for you guys, since you are joining really for more than an hour. 35 students are still there. So এখন তো শেষ করতে হবে তোমাদের সাথে, কিন্তু আমি একটু শান্তিনিকেতনের কথা বলবো আমি তোমাদেরকে, ঠিক আছে? So it's all about economics. We talked about economics for such a long time, but as you have seen, Ochirangshu is based in Shantiniketan, and I was been there in last October, though I didn't know that Ochirangshu was working there. So one thing I must share, that there is a Bangladesh
Bhavan. I always wanted to be there.
Yes, there is a Bangladesh Bhavan in Shantiniketan. So I always find two places where there is Bangladesh. The name is there. I always take pride of that. So Bangladesh Bhavan হয়েছে, ওটা হচ্ছে আমাদের বাংলাদেশের একটা মানে মিনি মিউজিয়ামের মতো, একটা সব হিস্টোরিক্যাল জিনিসগুলো, মুক্তিযুদ্ধ জাদুঘরের মতো একটা জায়গা। সো আই রিয়েলি ফাইন্ড ইট নাইস দ্যাট শান্তিনিকেতনও বাংলাদেশের একটা মানে স্থাপনা আছে। আরেকটা জিনিস বলবো, তোমরা তো সবাই ইকোনমিক্স স্টুডেন্ট, তো শান্তিনিকেতন অনেক ফেমাস মানুষজন কিন্তু পড়েছে। তোমরা দেখেছো যে ওপেন স্কুল কিভাবে গাছের নিচে এরকম একটা জায়গাতে ওনারা পড়তেন, পড়াশোনা করতেন, বা ওই আইডিয়াটা ছিল। তো ওখানে কারা কোনো ফেমাস মানুষজন পড়েছে, তোমরা কারো নাম জানো যে হ্যাঁ একজন ফেমাস ইকোনমিস্টের নাম জানি, বা ফেমাস কেউ যে শান্তিনিকেতনের পার্ট এন্ড পার্সেল বা ওখান থেকে পড়াশোনা করেছে, তোমরা জানো কেউ? হ্যাঁ বাংলাদেশের, অবশ্যই, হ্যাঁ বাংলাদেশের রেজওয়ানা চৌধুরী বন্যা। সো বেসিক্যালি শান্তিনিকেতন অবশ্যই ফেমাস তোমার আর্টস, ড্রামা, ডান্স এন্ড অল দিস। বাট অমর্ত্য সেনের নাম যদি তোমরা শুনে থাকো, ফেমাস ইকোনমিস্ট, সো হি অলসো ডিড হিজ স্কুলিং তো ওখানে, তাই না অচিরাংশু? অমর্ত্য সেনের মা বোধহয় টিচার ছিলেন ওখানে। তো ওনারা একটা বাড়িও আছে ওখানে, অমর্ত্য সেন। ইন্দিরা গান্ধীর নাম তোমরা নিশ্চয়ই শুনেছো। সো এরকম ফেমাস মানুষ করেছে। সো আমরা সবসময় তো আসলে অ্যালুমনাইদের প্রাইড নিই, যে আমাদের অ্যালুমনাই, শান্তিনিকেতনের অ্যালুমনাই কারা ছিল, এরকম অনেক অনেক বিখ্যাত বিখ্যাত মানুষ পড়াশোনা করেছেন ওখানে। তো আমরাও হোপফুলি একসময় তোমাদের প্রাইড নেব যে আমাদের স্টুডেন্ট ফেমাস ইকোনমিস্ট হয়েছে, বা কোনো বড় মানুষ হয়েছে, বা কিছু আর কি, কোনো না কোনো ভাবে তোমরা আমাদেরকে প্রাইডটা দেবে। তো আর এটাই, আর অচিরাংশু, থ্যাংক ইউ সো মাচ ফর বিং উইথ আস। আর আমাদের ইউনিভার্সিটি হচ্ছে খুবই টেক সেভি, খুবই মানে মডার্ন একটা স্থাপনা, শান্তিনিকেতনের মতো অবশ্যই না, খুব ছোট একটা ইউনিভার্সিটি। বাট আই রিয়েলি ওয়েলকাম ইউ টু বি হিয়ার। যখন এই প্যান্ডেমিক শেষ হবে, যখন সবকিছু শেষ হয়ে যাবে, হোপ উইল সি ইউ ইন আওয়ার ক্যাম্পাস। সো ইটস তোমার মানে একটা আমন্ত্রণ বা নিমন্ত্রণ রইল আর কি অচিরাংশুকে আমাদের পক্ষ থেকে, ইনস্টিটিউটের পক্ষ থেকে। হ্যাঁ
ম্যাম একটা জিনিস অ্যাড করছি, আমার স্টুডেন্ট।
সব্যসাচী বলো।
ম্যাম একটা জিনিস অ্যাড করছি, আমার মাও কিন্তু শান্তিনিকেতনের স্টুডেন্ট, 82 and 83 ব্যাচের।
ও আচ্ছা আচ্ছা, ডান্সার না?
হ্যাঁ ডান্সার, উনি
রাইট রাইট রাইট,
বাংলাদেশের মানে ওয়ান অফ দ্য বিগেস্ট ডান্স আর্টিস্ট।
আচ্ছা আচ্ছা আচ্ছা, হ্যাঁ 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 সব্যসাচী, হ্যাঁ আমাকে বলেছিলে তুমি, হ্যাঁ। সো সি হাউ দ্য ওয়ার্ল্ড ইজ কানেক্টেড, আমরা সবাই কানেক্টেড সবার সাথে। So Chirangshu, to the end, if you want to say something up for our students.
Yes, yes, I would like to thank all the students, excellent students. I'm very happy. I would have been more happy had we interacted, physically. I would like to see all of you, like to hear from you. And you are all welcome to Shantiniketan. You can send me an email, you can come over. And maybe Anunna can arrange something for the whole class.
Sure.
To come over here and, have a class under the trees. And have a look around Shantiniketan. I can help you out on that. And I hope someday to go to your university. I'd be very happy to see you all. And please stay safe, stay healthy, and we must all fight this COVID-19 together. And I will hopefully see you all after the pandemic is over.
Sure. Sure. Thank you so much, Ochirangshu. So it was a really wonderful session. First thing, we want to say something at the end. আমাদের কলিগ ছিলেন আমাদের সাথে এতক্ষণ, উনি ছিলেন, উনিও পুরো সেশনটাই শুনেছেন।
Really good. I have learned so many things and it was a refresh of my memories because অনেক কিছু পড়ে এসেছি কিন্তু আর পড়ানো হয়নি, যার জন্য একটু মনে ছিল না। এখন প্রেজেন্টেশনটা দেখে সব মনে পড়লো। ভেরি ইজি, খুব সুন্দর করে আপনি প্রেজেন্টেশন দিয়েছেন।
Thank you very much.
So thanks. So আমাদের এখন ক্লাসে একটা কুইজের পার্ট বাকি আছে, বাট অচিরাংশু, if you want to like say bye to our students, it's okay.
Yeah, so I leave, and thank you all once again, and hope we'll meet someday. So take care, all the best to all of you. My best wishes remain.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much.
ধন্যবাদ স্যার।
আচ্ছা, সো সবাই আছো এখনো? এখন তোমাদের জন্য তো কুইজ আছে একটা শেষে।
ম্যাম উপস্থিত আছি।
উপস্থিত আছো, হ্যাঁ আমি দেখতেই পাচ্ছি উপস্থিত আছো। আমি ভাবছিলাম জনের কোনো কোয়েশ্চেনে, জনের কোয়েশ্চেন ছাড়া তো কোনো সেশন শেষ হয়নি কখনো, সো ওয়েট করছিলাম আর কি। আচ্ছা, এখন কুইজটা আমি তাহলে তোমাদেরকে সেন্ড করছি ক্লাসরুমে, ঠিক আছে? 2 মিনিট লাগবে তোমাদের শেষ করতে, আসলে 1 মিনিট লাগার কথা। ওয়েট করো সবাই, ঠিক আছে? একটাই কোয়েশ্চেন কিন্তু।
তাহলে ম্যাম আমরা এই শান্তিনিকেতনের মতো ক্লাস করলে ম্যাম কেমন হয় এরপর থেকে ইউনিভার্সিটি যখন খুলে?
মাঠে
হ্যাঁ আমাদের জন্য
মাঠে অথবা ছাদে রুফটপে
ম্যাম ওনারা তো
ম্যাম আমরা একবার
বেশি
যাব
ক্লাস করে।
হ্যাঁ
হ্যাঁ নিশ্চয়ই, হ্যাঁ
একদিন তো ম্যাম অ্যারেঞ্জ করাই যায়।
করা যায় ম্যাম।
হ্যাঁ করা যায় অবশ্যই করা যায়। একটু উইন্টারে করব আমরা, অসুবিধা নেই, উইন্টারে অবশ্যই করব।
হ্যাঁ ম্যাম
ঠিক আছে, নো প্রবলেম।
Yes ma'am, looking forward to it.
শিওর।
হ্যাঁ সিআরবি তে অথবা কোন একটা মাঠের মাঝখানে।
না আমাদের তো গাছপালা আছে, আমাদের সিআরবি কেন যেতে হচ্ছে, আমাদের তো গাছপালা আছে।
হ্যাঁ তো বুঝাই যাচ্ছে তোমরা এখন পড়াশোনার মোডে আছো বলে আর মনে হচ্ছে না, বাট স্টিল আমি তোমাদেরকে পাঠিয়ে দিচ্ছি কুইজ, ঠিক আছে? কুইজ করবে তো নাকি? বোনাস মার্কস দরকার?
यस मैम obviously
ম্যাম মার্ক তো দরকার ম্যাম, আমি দিলে আর খুশি হতাম।
আচ্ছা এমনি না, এটা 1 মিনিট লাগবে। সো হার্ড ওয়ার্ক অলওয়েজ পেজ অফ, এটা মনে রাখবে সব সময়। এমনি ফ্রি পেলে কিন্তু ভালো লাগবে না, দেখবে। সো আমি এখনই পাঠিয়ে দিচ্ছি। ইন্টারমিডিয়েট ম্যাক্রো আগে পাবে, তারপরে পাবে প্রিন্সিপালস অফ ম্যাক্রো। সাইন আমি এখনই পাঠিয়ে দিচ্ছি। গন ফ্রম মাই এন্ড, ঠিক আছে? ইন্টারমিডিয়েট ম্যাক্রোর জন্য।
ম্যাম এখনো পাইনি।
হ্যাঁ পাবে, এখনো পাওনি, একটু ওয়েট করো। ইন্টারমিডিয়েট ম্যাক্রো গেছে, এরপর যাবে প্রিন্সিপালস অফ ম্যাক্রো।
ইয়েস ম্যাম পেয়েছি।
আমি 255 এ কিন্তু ক্লোজ করব, ঠিক আছে?
ম্যাম দিয়েছেন?
হ্যাঁ, আমি ইন্টারমিডিয়েট ম্যাক্রো দিয়ে দিয়েছি অলরেডি।
ম্যাম পাইনি।
আসে না ম্যাম এখনো।
একটু রিফ্রেশ করো,
এখনো পাই নাই ম্যাম।
ক্লাসরুমের মধ্যে একটু রিফ্রেশ করুন। আমি পেয়েছি।
আমিও পেয়েছি।
ম্যাম পাইনি তো।
আমি কাউকে বাদ দিন, একটু রিফ্রেশ করে নাও তাহলে পাবে। সবাই রিফ্রেশ করো, ইটস গন ফ্রম মাই এন্ড।